Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle with the suspension hanging so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to move along to removing our center cover. If you were to feel along it, you're going to find an area that you can carefully get in between with a small pry bar. Once you have that cover off of there, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel off of here, let's continue on to removing the 2 caliper slider bolts. You're going to find a 14mm headed bolt down low and one up high. We'll remove the pair. For this one, I'm just going to start it back in a couple threads to hold the caliper still while I continue and fully remove the second. Now I'll use my small pry bar. I'm going to gently pry this off of the caliper bracket. Once you have it off of there, you want to make sure you give the caliper a quick inspection. What you're paying attention for is to see if you see any fluid coming out of either of these dust boots around the caliper pistons. If it looks like the boots are worn, torn, or damaged in any way, or even leaking fluid, you're going to have to go ahead and replace the caliper. Ours looks fine, so I'm going to go ahead and start pushing back these 2 caliper pistons. There's several ways you can push in the caliper pistons, but the one way that you cannot is by pushing them in one at a time. If I was to press in this piston right here, the fluid pressure is going to push this one out. So with that said, you need to push them both in at the same time. That's easiest using a tool that looks like this. As I push in the pistons, I'm going to try to go extremely slow. What's happening here is I'm pushing the fluid up inside this area, and it's going to make its way back up through the brake lines. Typically, it's a good idea to open up the bleeder screw, but there is always the possibility that it might break off. If you're going to do it without pushing in the bleeder screw, just do it nice and slow. At this point, we're going to continue on to removing the 2 brake pads. Once you have your pads out of there, it's a good idea to give them a close inspection. Typically, I just look to see if it looks like it's worn at an angle. If it's worn at an angle, generally that means either the pad was stuck in the bracket, which you can see ours was, or maybe one of the slider pins was frozen, or even one of the pistons. Now it's time to remove the caliper bracket. We're going to be looking for 2 15mm headed bolts. You can see one right out in the open. The other one's going to be right behind this area of the knuckle. Remove your bracket, give it a quick inspection, make sure it doesn't look broken or damaged, and then set it aside. Now let's move out here and remove our cover. I'll use this tool right here. You can grab right onto it and pop it off. Once you have it off, you want to make sure you give this portion a good inspection. It can't be broken or damaged in any way. You definitely don't want to go poking any holes in it because it's supposed to keep moisture and debris away from your bearings. Let's remove our cotter pin. Now we're going to remove this right here. This is the lock for the nut. You can see that it has a whole bunch of slots on it. Those slots need to line up with the corresponding hole in the axle when we go to put this together. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Moving along, we're going to remove this center nut right here. You can easily do that with a pair of pliers. Underneath that, there's going to be a washer and then an outer bearing on here. You can remove the pair just by simply holding onto this area, and we're going to slide the entire rotor off of the assembly. Now I'll go ahead and turn this over on a bench. There's our washer, and here's our outer bearing. Now looking at the back side of this rotor, we're going to have to start removing the seal so we can get to the inner bearing in here. To do this, I'm going to carefully get underneath it. You can use a pry bar or whatever you might happen to have, but we just want to get under the seal and then gently pry it up and away. Underneath that is your inner bearing. Time to move back over to the knuckle. We need to make sure we clean down this axle right along here, but we also need to pay special attention up closer to where the knuckle is. You want to make sure that it's smooth. It's not worn or damaged in any way. If it is, you're going to have an issue with the seal. All right, so I have this area fully cleaned down and I thoroughly inspected it. It looks like it's in perfect condition. I'm going to move up to this area, give it a quick cleaning as well. For this, you can either use a wire brush or even some sandpaper. Let's go ahead and clean that brake rotor. I'm going to make sure I clean both of the braking surfaces and along inside of the rotor where those bearings are going to need to ride. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you clean the bearings. After you clean them, you need to inspect each one of the bearings to make sure you don't see any scoring or discoloring. If you see either of those, it means that the bearing could potentially be damaged and it doesn't make any sense to reuse them. Alright, so now it's going to be time to pack those bearings. There's several ways you can do this, including just put a little pile of grease on a gloved hand and then just take one of your bearings and start rubbing it into the grease. You want to pack it inside of both sides of this line, making its way in between each of the bearings. Do it on this side and on the other. Of course, you're going to do it on both bearings. If you have one of these tools or even a larger tool, that's going to work a little easier. For this, I'm going to take my larger bearing first. I'll slide it right on top of the tool. Put the smaller bearing on top of that one. We'll slide this down so it's into the grease. Screw this back in position, and then we're going to slowly force it down, paying attention to the grease coming up and through the bearings. Now I'll just put everything together and I'm going to start pressing it. We want to watch the grease come up and through the bearings. Looking inside here, I can see that I had grease coming up and through both sets of bearings. That's a good sign. You want to make sure these bearings are well lubricated, otherwise you're going to have bearing noise and bearing failure. Just going to go ahead and work that grease around the bearings a little bit here, and then we'll pull them out of the system. As you can tell, that's well coated. I'm just going to work my way all the way around here. More the merrier. Now I'm going to lubricate inside this area where the race is going to be. We'll put our bearing right down on top of that. It should slide right in. I'll wipe out any excess grease inside this area where the seal is going to go. Now I'm just going to wipe out the inner area here with my rag. And we can get ready to install our seal. We'll just take this, we're going to put it in place as flat and level as possible. Now you're going to want to have something flat that can fit over the top of this so you can drive it down and into position. You need to give this a thorough inspection. Make sure it's bottomed out all the way around. If it isn't, there's the possibility moisture could make its way in, which would be very bad. At this point, I just take a little bit of this grease and I come right along the inside of the seal. At this point, I'll just take a little bit of this grease and I'm going to only apply a thin amount along this area right where the seal's going to go. That looks pretty good. Now I'll thoroughly cover this shaft. You don't need to get any on the threads so much as just the smooth aspect of the shaft itself. We're at the point that we need to start cleaning up the nut, the washer, and our protective cover. I'm just going to use some parts cleaner inside of a collection bucket. That way there I can recycle all the fluid after I'm done properly. Let's go ahead and slide the rotor onto the axle stud here. Once you have it slid on there, we're going to want to tilt it a little bit. We're going to use a little bit of that high temperature grease and try to pack it right inside the rotor. That way there, when things heat up and things start to liquefy, it's going to fill that inner portion a little bit. Let's pack it right in there. Now it doesn't have to be packed full. You just want to make sure that there is some grease inside the center pocket of the rotor. Now it's going to be time for the outer bearing. Make sure that the bevel lines up with the race that's on the inside. You don't want to put it on backwards. Get some of that grease out of there. Make sure that the bearing does not fall down and hit the ground. If it gets any dirt on it, you need to fully clean it and then repack it with brand new grease. We'll put the washer on next, and then we're going to also put on the nut. I'll just bottom this out by hand. Now we'll clean up some of our mess so we can continue tightening. Now once you have it cleaned down to the point you can see everything clearly, we'll continue on with some pliers, and I'm going to grab onto this nut right here. I'm just going to turn this until it feels like it's nice and snug. I'm not putting any pressure on it, I just want it to bottom out, right there. Now at this point you want to spin this rotor several times in both directions. What we're trying to do here is work out any air bubbles that might be inside the system. You're going to see that more and more grease pushes its way out, and that's a good thing because it's going to take up the gap, and then you're going to be able to tighten this a little bit more along the way. That went quite a bit more right there. Take it the other way. All right. So all you do really for torquing these is to pretty much just do exactly what I was just doing. I'm grabbing onto this nut and I'm giving it a little twist as I'm spinning this, and as soon as it bottoms out right there, that should be a perfect amount of pressure. You don't want to have it so it's too much pressure where you're tightening it down with a ratchet of some sort, but you also don't want it so loose that this could actually loosen up a little bit and your rotor starts to wobble, in which case you're going to find that you have a wheel vibration and or a brake pulsation. I'm just going to wipe this down so it's nice and clean at this point. We also went ahead and cleaned up this locking ring. We're going to go ahead and line it up with the nut and make sure we have one of the slots lined up with the hole in the axle stud. After that, take a brand new cotter pin, slide it right on through there. Peen it over so there's no way this can loosen up on its own. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is going to be very important. You want to take a rag and you want to get right onside the inner groove right here. Basically, you can feel along the outer aspect of the rotor. You've got this flat line along the front, but just on the inside, that same lip, clean that down as well. That's good enough. Now it's time for the cover. Before you go ahead and put that on there, you want to go ahead and coat it with something such as maybe a gasket maker or some sort of sealant. We want to make sure that no moisture or debris makes its way in here, in which case we'll ruin the grease and even the bearings located behind it. I'm just going to use some gasket maker, and you can pretty much use any color you want. Just make my way right around this, a nice bead. We'll line this up with the rotor and drive it into position. Go ahead and remove the excess. Inspect it, make sure it's completely sealed all the way around. We're at the point that it's time to clean down the caliper bracket. To clean the bracket, we're going to first remove the tins along each side. Just go ahead and give those a quick inspection and set them aside for recycling. Now, once you have those off of there, we're going to continue on to the slider pins. For each of these slider pins, you're going to have a pin that comes down and through this boot and into the caliper. I'm going to carefully grab onto the pin and the caliper boot and lift it up and off of the caliper bracket. Now I'm just going to take this and I'm going to press the pin down while I try to also remove the boot from the pin without damaging the boot in any way. Now I want to have a look at this caliper pin right here. There's something I want to show you. On one of the caliper pins on each bracket, you're going to have a boot that looks like this. This is a vibration dampener. And when you go to reinstall this, after everything's cleaned and prepared, you need to make sure you put it back inside the same original port. So go ahead and mark it or do whatever you have to do, but it needs to go into the same port. I'll set these aside, do the same to the other side of the bracket. As you can tell, this pin does not have the boot on it. Now you're going to want to put your bracket inside of a collection receptacle. We're going to have to clean each of these caliper slider ports. To do that, I'll use some parts cleaner directly in the port. Just keep in mind, it could potentially spray back out at your face. Now that I have that sitting in there doing its job, I'll continue on with a bore brush. This is just a wire brush that goes inside and it's going to clean up any of the dirt or debris inside. We'll give this a little spray, let it sit for a second. While I'm letting that soak, I'm going to make my way over to this area. You can feel that there's a little lip that goes in. We want to make sure you clean that out completely. This is the area that the boot's going to sit, and there needs to be no dirt or debris or raised areas. You can use whatever you happen to have, maybe even a brush of some sort. Let's give this a little rinse. Wipe it down, give it a close inspection, especially along that ring, and take a peek inside. Assuming that looks good, do the exact same thing to the other side of the caliper bracket. Now that I have both of the ports cleaned down, I'm going to continue on to the areas that I went ahead and I removed the caliper bracket tins from. You want to make sure it's a clean, smooth surface, so when you put the new tins on with some lubricant, the pads will be able to flow smoothly. Now that looks good. We're going to go ahead and turn this over real quick and we'll clean the inside of the bracket right here. This is where the rotor is going to sit. You want to make sure there aren't any rust flakes in there as well. At this point, the bracket's fully cleaned and it's almost fully prepared. We're going to set this aside. And we're going to move along to those caliper slider pins. Now for the slider pins, there's going to be a couple areas that you want to pay attention to. You have the shaft area that needs to be smooth so it can flow in and out of the bracket, but also down closest to where my lower fingers are, there's another groove. That's another spot where the boot sits, so go ahead and clean that out as well. Just go ahead and take a little wire brush to this, clean it up as good as possible. Now, as you can tell, inside the groove is nice and clean, and the entire shaft is clean as well. The last thing I want to do for the pin that has the vibration dampener on it is just make sure it's still secured to the pin. If it looks like it's swollen and it seems like it wants to slide right off of there, you have to go ahead and replace that, otherwise you're going to have braking issues. This one's fine. I'll set it aside, clean the other. That one looks good as well. Set it aside, and now we're on to the caliper slider boots. Now before you go ahead and clean these, just go ahead and give them a nice stretch. You want to make sure that they're still soft and pliable and they're not torn or worn or damaged in any way. If they are, just go ahead and replace them. As you can tell, this one's fine. So to clean this, I'm going to clean the inside using a rag. I'll just go ahead and twist it, slide it right on through. Now once I have the rag through there, I'll spread this and then just roll it around a little bit, and essentially what I'm trying to do is clean out any of the grease that's on the inside. We'll give it one last inspection on the inside there. Perfect. Set that aside, do the same to the other one. Okay, so we have everything fully cleaned down. I also went ahead and I grabbed my brand new tins that came with my kit. I'm going to use some high temperature caliper lubricant, and we're going to lubricate each one of these caliper slider pins. Get the entire shaft all the way around, and then also make sure you get down and into that groove. You're going to want to make sure you do this on the pin itself and on the caliper where the boot's going to be. Go ahead and take that slider pin boot and slide it right on over the top until you hear it click into position. Slide it into its original port. Like I said before, do not mix up your caliper slider pins. I'm going to go ahead and work this boot around a little bit. Make sure that the grease is making its way in and doing its job. Clean up my mess, and then I'll do the exact same thing for the other slider pin. Oh yeah. Let's continue on with that high temperature caliper grease one more time here. We're going to come right inside each one of these ears right here. I'm just going to go ahead and spread it around so there's a nice smooth layer. It doesn't need to be very thick. This is essentially just for vibration dampening and to make sure it keeps moisture away from the area we went ahead and cleaned up. Now we can take one of our caliper bracket tins and we're going to slide it right in position. You want to make sure that you have the locking tabs that are along the center slid in so that this cannot move around on the bracket once it's secured. Give it a wiggle, make sure it's secured, do the exact same thing. Once you've cleaned and lubricated the bracket, let's move back over to the caliper. I'm going to use my brush here and just try to remove any of the existing rust or debris that's in the area. I don't want anything to fall into the brakes while I'm driving down the road. Let's use some more of that high temperature caliper grease, and we're going to go along the center of each one of these pistons, just on the metal area. Once you have both of those done, continue on to each of the 3 ears. This is for vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Let's get that caliper bracket in position. Now we'll take each one of our caliper bracket bolts with the threads cleaned and a little bit of red thread locker, and we'll start each of them in, bottom them out, and then we'll torque them to manufacturer specification. Let's torque each one of these bolts to 83 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. As you slide these into position on the caliper bracket, you want to make sure that they slide in without any force. If you have to force them in or even use a hammer, more than likely the bracket isn't cleaned well enough. Go ahead and clean that up a little better. Just going to wiggle these around to make sure that they are not stuck inside the bracket in any way. Let's get this caliper on here. Now we'll take our 2 caliper slider bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. Go ahead and start those on there. We'll bottom these out and torque each of these to 24 foot-pounds. Now let's go ahead and put the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now that the wheel's back on the ground, let's torque these to 100 foot-pounds. Of course, if you have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Looking at the back of it, you're going to find you have one area that protrudes looking like this. That needs to fit into any of your lug nut holes. Okay friends, so we got one side of the truck together. Of course, you're going to want to make sure that you make your way over to the other side of the vehicle and do the exact same thing. After that, go ahead and hop inside the vehicle, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Make your way under the hood to the master cylinder. Double check that fluid. If it's a little low, top it off with .3. Close it off, close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.